The Queen of Attolia, Chapter 4. The Queen of Eddis stood in the courtyard to meet her thief when they brought him up the mountain. With her stood those of the court she couldn't order to be elsewhere. She remembered Eugenides asking once why so many of the events around her looked like a circus, and why he always had the part of the dancing bear. When she saw the litter they carried him in, it looked nothing so much as a cage, though it was closed off by curtains and not bars. Edesian soldiers carried the litter. They had taken it from the Attolians at the base of the mountain and carefully lifted it up the winding road that followed the old watercourse of the Arachthus River. The Attolians walked beside it, and her ambassador and his party walked behind. Meeting her gaze as they entered the courtyard, the ambassador shook his head slightly, warning her to expect the worst. He had sent her word already of events in Attolia. When his messenger had delivered the ambassador's news, Eddis had ordered the room emptied and had stayed to sit by herself on the throne. When the daylight falling in the skylights had faded, a servant had come with a taper for the lamps, but Eddis had sent him away. There was no formal dinner that night. The court dined in its private rooms, and finally the most senior of her attendants had come to coax the queen to bed. "There is nothing you can do, my darling, sitting here in the dark. Come to bed," Xanthe had said. "I can think, Xanthe, and I need to think a little more. I'll be up soon, I promise." And Xanthe had gone upstairs to the queen's chambers to wait patiently as the night passed. In the morning, Eddis had spoken privately with her ministers and then waited, knowing Attolia would send Eugenides home when she was done with him, and not before. The litter was a fine one, used no doubt to carry an Attolian noble through the narrow streets of Attolia's older cities. It had doors that slid closed and locked to keep the ornaments in the fabric of the interior safe when the litter was not in use. They also served to keep the thief locked in until he reached Eddis. This had hardly been necessary, but the Attolian guards sent with the litter had been ordered to take no chances and to hurry. They had turned the litter over to the Edesians and followed up the mountain to see its contents delivered. Once the litter had been lowered to the ground, the ranking officer among the Attolians stepped forward to slide back the curtain that screened the interior. "He'll need a hand getting out," he said, and another of the Attolians choked on a laugh. The officer reached in and, grasping Eugenides by the back of the neck, slid his unconscious body off the cushions and onto the sun-warmed stones of the forecourt. "Our queen said to tell you this is how we treat thieves in Attolia, and she awaits the water of the Arachthus," said the Attolian, but the sly expression on his face faded as the queen stared at him impassively. From where she stood, she couldn't know if the thief was alive or dead, and she didn't look as if she cared. The Attolian lifted one hand to rub the back of his neck where his hair was prickling, realizing he may have been sent on this errand because his guard captain didn't care if all that returned was his head. "Galen," said the queen, but the palace physician was already stepping forward with his assistants. "He's alive still," said Galen, and after checking for a heartbeat, he started to pick the boy up, but the minister of war tapped his shoulder and stooped himself to gather Eugenides in his arms and carry him inside. The crowd parted to allow him to pass, onlookers catching a single glimpse of Eugenides' face and then swiveling to eye the Attolians. The Attolians shifted from foot to foot and drew themselves together. Eddis summoned her steward. These men will want to eat before they start down to Attolia, she said quietly. See that they are fed and paid for the service they have rendered us in returning our thief. The Attolians exchanged nervous glances, concerned that their payment might be fatal, but beheading them was something Attolia might do, not Eddis. They would each receive a silver griffin and a good meal before being escorted to the border. To the senior Attolian, the queen said, "Tell Attolia I have freed the waters of the Arachthus. They will flow by sundown." The message was for formality's sake. News of the water flow would reach Attolia long before the messengers did. Eddis turned, and the crowd, which hadn't regrouped entirely after the passage of the Minister of War, parted again for her, and then trailed silently after her into the palace. Eddis seated herself on her throne. "Where's the messenger?" she said, and one of the soldiers charged for that day with the duty of carrying the queen's messages stepped forward. She noted that he was one of her first cousins, which suited her. "Crowdeyes," she said, "carry me a message to the engineer at the reservoir, telling him to release the waters of the Arachthus this evening, as we agreed. Then go on to the officer in charge of the bridge at the pass." The country of Eddis lay in the mountains between the two countries of Sonus and Attolia. Through the Hestephial mountains there was one pass to carry trade between the two lowland countries. It had been carved by the Sapachia River as it cut through the softer limestone of the coastal mountains on its way from Attolia to Sonus and the Middle Sea. All traffic between Attolia and Sonus climbed the mountain pass, crossing several bridges in the process, the most important being the main bridge, which spanned the chasm of the Sapachia near the top of the pass. On one bank there was no traversable path to Attolia, and on the far bank there was none to Sonus. All traffic bottlenecked at the bridge, and Eddis controlled it. "To the officer at the bridge," said Eddis, "my compliments to him for his well-performed duties, and he will detain the next 10 Attolian traders and their trade caravans. He is to confiscate everything but the clothes on their back and turn them loose. If they protest, tell them that they may apply to their queen for compensation." "Yes, your majesty." "Your majesty!" People in the room turned to look at the Attolian ambassador. "It is my obligation to assure you that news of this will not be well received by my queen." "I expect not," said Eddis, and turned back to her messenger. "Crowdeyes," she said, "tell him the next 10 large caravans." Politically, the loss of Eugenides' service was severe. Sonus was still eager to expand his borders, and only his fear of assassination kept him in check. But Attolia hadn't had merely a political loss in mind. If she had wanted Eddis to be without the thief's services, she could have executed him. She meant to hurt Eddis at every level, and she had succeeded. 100 caravans of merchandise couldn't repair the damage. Sighing inwardly, Eddis excused herself and went upstairs to see her thief. The library was empty, but the connecting door to Eugenides' study and bedchamber was open. Eugenides lay on his bed, and Galen, the palace physician, bent over him. He straightened as the queen entered. "He's unconscious?" Eddis asked, standing by the bed. "He's drugged," said the physician. "We got some lethem drops into him." He was glad she hadn't come earlier. Eugenides was feverish and hadn't recognized anyone when he awakened. They had to hold him down and force the lethem into his mouth. There had been no way to measure what had gone in and what he had spat out again. "How's his arm?" the queen asked. The physician shook his head and gestured to the filthy bandages. I haven't got into his arm. I assume it was well cauterized or it would stink more. The physician pushed the hair off Eugenie's forehead. His head isn't broken, although clearly it might have been. You can see the bruising on his forehead, but if he cracked his skull, he'd probably be dead already. I'm more worried about his right eye, which is infected. See the grit on his eyelashes? The physician pointed it out, sweeping his finger above the lashes, careful not to brush them. If it's prison glower, the physician explained, he'll lose the sight in that eye. And if the infection spreads, he'll be blind in both. He shrugged helplessly. 2 servants bearing ewers of warm water slipped into the room behind the queen. You can't treat it? I'm not an oculist. I've sent for one in town, but as far as I know, there isn't a treatment. There's a man in Attolia who says he has an ointment that will keep the infection from spreading. But whether he does, and whether he'd come here... He held up his hands. He'll come if I say he will, said Edis. He's Attolian, your majesty. He'll still come, she said. The physician looked up. The queen gave him a brief, hard smile. She wasn't joking. She'd have the Attolian abducted and dragged up the mountain if need be. Your majesty, it may not be Glower. The oculist from town should be here soon. How soon? An hour or 2. Until then, your majesty, I do have work to do. Edis nodded. I'll leave it to you then. I want to know what the oculist says. When Edis was gone, the physician looked down at Eugenides and saw the glint of his eyes through his lashes. He looked closer. You'll need more lithium, he said. I won't, Eugenides whispered. The physician looked at the bandages that still needed to be changed. You will, he said, and went to mix several drops of the medicine with water in a tiny horn cup. When he came back, Eugenides' eyes were open, and he was watching the physician carefully. When he raised the cup, Eugenides turned his head away. No more trouble, please, young man. Galen, he whispered, do you think that if people are crippled in this life, they are crippled in the afterlife as well? The physician lowered the cup. You would know that better than I, he said. No, said Eugenides. I don't know. Galen raised the cup again, but Eugenides continued to turn his face away. Galen, I don't want to be blind when I die. Galen sat silently, with the cup held in his hands, and his hands resting in his lap. His physicians slipped away. You aren't going to die for a long time. I don't want to be blind when I die, if I live to be 100. Do you imagine I am going to pour a cup of lithium down your throat and let you go? Galen said finally. I'd appreciate it, Eugenides said. I took an oath to heal people. Eugenides didn't argue. He only turned to look at the physician with his eyes underlined by black bruises and bright with fever. The scar on his cheek showed against the yellowed skin around it. Galen sighed. It might not be Glower, and there's no need to talk about breaking oaths yet. He raised the cup in his hand. Drink this, for now. When Eugenides woke, it was dark, and the oculist had come. The room was lit by candles that reflected in the many panes of the glass windows and shone on the 2 men sitting by the bed. Galen had awakened him with a gentle touch on his arm, but even that gentle touch had worsened 100 different pains, and the dull ache in his head and the burning in his eye. Both of his eyes felt as if full of hot sand, and the rest of his body hurt so badly he couldn't be sure where the pain came from. The oculist examined him as gently as possible, holding a lighted candle close to his face, then moving it away again. "When did you notice the infection?" Eugenides could only shake his head, and then regret it. He didn't know what day it was, or how long he had been in the Queen's prison cell. He tried to think, but his thoughts teetered on the edge of the black pit filled with memories that threatened to drown him. "Before she cut off my hand," he said finally. The oculist looked at the physician. "Say a week ago," he said. "Maybe 10 days. The oculist lifted his candle again. Eugenides flinched, but didn't complain. "Sticky eye," said the oculist finally. "If it were Glauer, the eye would be more red by now, and much more sensitive to the light. Keep it clean, and try to get some decent food into him." He looked down at Eugenides and said firmly, "Hundreds of little children survive this every year with their insight intact. You have nothing to worry about on that count." On that count, Eugenides thought, and when Galen offered him another dose of lithium, he drank it and slept. In Attolia, the Queen sat at dinner. The hall was lit with the finest candles. The food was excellent. The Queen ate very little. "Your thoughts seem elsewhere tonight, your Majesty," said the man seated to her right in the place of honor. "Not at all, Nahusarsh," Attolia assured her Mede ambassador. "Not at all." Eugenia's fever grew worse. He slipped into the pit of his memories, and Galen repeatedly dosed him with the lithium to give him some rest. No longer recognizing Galen or his assistants, he fought every dose as he fought the first. He had to be held down, and Galen, with most of his weight on Eugenides' chest, tipped the lithium into his mouth as Eugenides screamed. To keep the lithium from spilling out again, Galen covered the boy's mouth with his hand and covered his nose as well. Eugenides couldn't breathe until the lithium was swallowed, and he fought with all of his strength, struggling to turn his head away. Galen could feel his body aching underneath as he tried to throw the weight off his chest. Not until he was exhausted and nearly unconscious would he swallow. Eddis sat, white-faced, in the library. "He won't thank you for listening to this," said her Minister of War. Sitting down beside her, he too had come to the library to check on his son. "Have you ever heard him make a noise like that?" "No." Eddis couldn't remember a time herself. His screams sounded as if they were dragged out of him with a hook. "Is he getting worse?" Eugenides' father shook his head. "The same, I think." He settled into his chair. "If he fights this much when they try to get the lithium into him, I suppose he's got some strength in him yet." "Is it like this every time?" Her Minister of War nodded. The Queen left the chair abruptly and went to stand in the doorway of the bedchamber. "Eugenides!" she snapped. Galen looked up, meaning to send her away, but the struggling figure on the bed had frozen. Eugenides opened his eyes, blinking them in bewilderment. The people around the bed relaxed. "Stop making an ass of yourself and swallow the lithium," she told him. Eugenides swallowed and shuddered as the bitter draught went down. Galen took his hand away. "My queen?" Eugenides whispered, still confused. "Go to sleep," ordered Eddis. Eugenides, obedient to his queen and the lithium, closed his eyes. "Effective," said the minister as she returned to sit next to him in the library. "We'll see what Galen says. the queen said, embarrassed, but she waited instead of returning to her meeting with her Minister of Trade. To her surprise, the physician, when he appeared, was pleased with the results of her interruption. "He recognized you. He hasn't recognized anyone else. Come back when you can." In the morning, Eddis stood by Eugenides' bedside, waiting for him to wake. She asked Galen about the bruises under his eyes, and he said that the black marks were old blood that had been trapped under the skin. She had known that much, but she wondered why his nose hadn't been broken then, if the bruising around his eyes was so dark. Galen explained the blood was from the blow to his forehead, and it had drained into his eye sockets. He said it might take several weeks to fade. In the meantime, the bruises made his face seem thinner and his skin more pale. She sat and watched him sleep, remembering other times she had seen him with bruises. He had often had them after fights with his cousins. They had teased him because of his name and teased him more as his father's interest in him grew. Eugenides had a tongue that sometimes moved faster than his thoughts, and he responded with taunts of his own, usually more cutting or so effective that the cousin's attentions were diverted to his victim and Eugenides escaped. More often, the teasing ended in blows and in bruises. When his mother had died, Eugenides hadn't waited to tell his father his intentions to be the next thief of Eddis. His father, the loss of his wife still fresh, had been enraged. Eugenides and his father had fought, both of them exercising their grief and anger with each other and in front of the entire court. The cousins, who idolized the Minister of War, increased their attacks on Eugenides, and bad feelings grew until Eddis had moved him out of the boys' dormitory and into the only free room she could think of, an anteroom to the rarely used palace library. He had cleaned the dust off the shelves and honed rudimentary reading skills into a taste for scholarship not uncommon among the thieves of Eddis, and when he had fought his periodic disastrous losing battles with his cousins, he had retreated to the library and his study bedchamber to nurse his bruises. Eddis had visited him often in times of internal exile. She hadn't taken his side. It was too obvious to everyone involved that he had brought trouble on himself, and he was anything but a helpless victim. His cousins had begun to lose cherished objects and find them again on the temple altar dedicated forever to the god of thieves. Eddis hadn't supported his cousins either when they had come to her with their complaints. They were her cousins as well, and she had fought with them herself until her two older brothers had died of fever within the space of a few days, and she had become the heir to Eddis. Within a few months, she had become queen, and after that, no one fought with her except in formal, polite, tedious ways. No one except Eugenides, who continued to abuse her about her taste in her clothes and relatives as if the existence of the cousins were her fault. "Exile them all," he suggested. "You know I can't. Someday they're going to be my officers in my army, and my ministers of trade, and the exchequer." "You can make me an officer instead." "You tore up your enrollment papers during the last fight with your father." "I'll be your minister." "Ha! Of the exchequer? You'd rob me blind." "I would never steal from you," he said hotly. "Oh, where's my tourmaline necklace? Where are my missing earrings?" That necklace was hideous. It was the only way to keep you from wearing it. "My earrings? What earrings?" "Eugenides!" she had laughed. "If Cleon beats you, it's because you deserve it." She never worried about his complaints. She worried only when he was quiet. Either he was plotting something so outrageous it would bring her entire court to her throne howling for his blood, or he had been fighting with his father, or, on very rare occasions, it meant that he had been seriously hurt. One of his cousins had broken several of his ribs once in a beating, and once he slipped while making his way across an icy wall, and had fallen to the ground with his leg twisted underneath him. It was a hazard of thieves to fall, often to their deaths, as his mother had done. When hurt, he had been white-faced and quiet, staying in his rooms until he started to heal, and then, when he was feeling better, he'd complain constantly. He didn't, however, tell her who had broken his ribs, or how he sprained his knee. Numerous eager tattletales told her about Titus, and the other bit of news she dragged out of the palace physician, who dragged it from Eugenides while working on the leg. Galen was also used to seeing Eugenides' bruises and listening with no visible sympathy to his complaints. Eddis leaned forward to brush the hair away from Eugenides' damp forehead. Galen had cut most of the thief's long hair, and he looked very different without it. She wouldn't have guessed that his hair, cut short, would form small curls at his temple and behind his ears. She brushed one of them back into place. "My queen," he said quietly, opening his eyes. "My thief," she said sadly. "She knew I was in the palace," he said in a low voice, sounding very tired. "She knew where I was hiding. She knew how I'd get out of the city. She knew everything. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have sent you." He shook his head. "No, I made mistakes. I don't know what they were. I've been trying to think. I just don't know. I failed you, my queen," he said, his voice getting weaker. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry." "Sorry," the Eddis bitterly, and Eugenides' eyes opened again. "I'll tell you, she will be sorry when she's the one hanging head down from her palace walls." She was crumpling the fine fabric of her dress in her fists. She smoothed it out and then stood up to pace. "Galen will throw me out if I upset you," she said, sitting down again. "You're not upsetting me. It's good to see you storming around." "She doesn't storm," he said, looking away into the empty space. "When she's angry, she sits. And when she's sad, she sits. If she was ever happy, she'd just sit, I think." It was more than he had said for days, and when he was done, he closed his eyes. Eddis thought he was sleeping. She stood and walked to the window. It was set high in the wall. The sill was at her eye level, and the glass panes reached nearly to the ceiling. By standing on her toes, she could see into the front courtyard. It was empty. "She was within her rights," Eugenides said behind her. Eddis spun around. "She was not!" "It was a common punishment for thieves." "Don't be stupid," snapped Eddis. "They hadn't cut the hand off a thief in Attolia in 100 years. And anyway, you're not a common thief. You're my thief. You're a member of the royal family. She attacked all of Eddis through you, and you know it." "Eddis had no business in her palace," Eugenides was whispering. Eddis knew he was tired. "Attolia has no business treating with the Medes," she said, her voice raised. Galen opened the door and gave her a warning look. "Go away!" she snapped. He shook his head, but stepped back, leaving the door open. "It was the act of a barbarian!" Eddis turned back to Eugenides. His eyes were closed. "And she's going to be sorry," she said as she left. Out in the library, Galen bowed very formally, excusing himself before he stepped past her. After he had seen Eugenides and dosed him again with the narcotics, He found Edis waiting in the library. She was in one of the armchairs with her knees up and her feet pulled in under her skirts. "Both of you in tears now," he said. Edis sniffed. "I'm angry." "He's not strong enough for you to be angry." He looked helpless for a moment. "Oh, I know," said the Queen, sighing. "He's too weak to listen to me yelling. If he dies, it's my fault. It's already my fault that he's lost his hand. And I've only the gods to thank he isn't blind as well." She pulled back her skirt a little way to reveal an underskirt, which she used to wipe her eyes. She sniffed and then stood up. Galen watched with amusement. She smiled at him. "Go on with your lecture." "Which is?" Galen asked. Edis put one hand to her chest and orated. "If you choose that, after a lifetime of service to your family, my advice is to be ignored and I am to leave my post, then that is your prerogative. But so long as I am physician of the palace, I will insist that my prescriptions for the well-being of my patients will be observed. Am I getting this right?" she asked. "Yes." "I think I can guess the rest as well," said the Queen. "Thank you, Your Majesty," said Galen. "I'm grateful not to have to say it myself." So the Queen of Edis visited Eugenides while he slept. The fever passed, but left him terribly thin and unable to do much more than sleep most of the day and night. Galen said it might be some time before he regained his strength. On the rare occasions when Edis was awake, Edis talked to him about the harvest, which was good, and about the weather, which was good, and not about her meetings with her ministers, the directors of her mines, the master of the royal forge, or the commanders of her small army, nor about the many diplomatic messages arriving from Sonus and Attolia. When he was in less pain and awake more often, she told him what gossip she could from the court and apologized for coming to see him infrequently. "If you had more time, Galen wouldn't let you in anyway." "True," the Queen agreed. "And he listens to make sure I don't upset you. I bet his ear is flat against the door even as we speak," she whispered, and got a rare smile in response. She leaned back in her chair and pulled the thin gold circlet from her head in order to run her fingers through her short hair. "I'm going to pull it out all before I'm 30, she said. "I swear there's someone asking me one thing or another from the moment I wake up until the time I close my eyes at night. When Xanthe wakes me in the morning, she asks me if I like my breakfast. I wish she'd just put it in front of me. It would be one less decision to make." He didn't ask what decisions kept her preoccupied. She didn't tell him. "I'll see you in a few days if I can." She leaned over the bed to kiss him on the forehead. "Eat something," she said, and left. In Attolia, the Queen listened carefully to a report sent by her ambassador in Edis. "The fever didn't kill him," she observed. "It seems not, Your Majesty." "Very well," she said.